Democratic Whip.
Madam President, are we in a quorum call?
No, we are not.
Well, thank you very much. October the 4th, 1957. Many in the chamber were not alive at that date. I was. I was a teenager, maybe in high school, just starting, or at the end of grade school. But it was a big day in the history of the world, October the 4th, 1957, because at 7:28 p.m. at night, the Russians launched Sputnik. Sputnik was a basketball-sized satellite. And we were concerned because we believed the Russians, then the Soviet Union, had the capacity to drop an atomic or nuclear bomb on the United States, and if they could do it from space, for goodness sakes, how would we defend ourselves? So a mild panic hit America, particularly in this town of Washington. And out of that panic came a pretty good idea as far as I was concerned. They decided that for the first time in the history of the United States, we would start loaning money to college-age students so they could go to college. The notion was if we had to fight the Russians or the Soviets in technology, we better have people educated and prepared to do it. And so someone who in those days sat down and wrote up the names of these wonderful ideas came up with a great one. It was called the National Defense Education Act. And the National Defense Education Act said that those who applied for federal college loans could borrow money and pay it back at 3% interest, but not have to pay until 1 year out of college, and then they had 10 years to pay it off. I didn't know at the time, but that turned out to be my ticket to college. There was no way that my family could afford to send me, nor I could afford to go to school at good schools from any money that I had saved or could earn during the summer. It was the government loans that got me through it. And I wasn't alone. By the tens of thousands, students all over the United States took out these National Defense Education Act loans. Well, what happened as a result of that idea that we could educate ourselves out of this problem? It worked. It worked dramatically. In the early 1960s, there was this explosive expansion of our economy, of technology and research and scientific endeavor that we took advantage of for decades and still do to this day. I think about the race to the moon and all the other things that we set our sights on. And they were all based on enough well-educated people at every level who could compete with countries around the world and do it successfully. So the concept was sound, and I think it was executed not flawlessly, but very well for myself and for many others. And I ended up borrowing enough money to get through college and law school. The amount of the debt, if I even said it on the floor today, would draw a laugh from the pages and everyone else because it was so small, but it was enough debt that just scared me to death. It was the equivalent of 50% of my gross pay coming out of law school in 1 year. But most students today would accept that in a second. 50% of their gross wages in the first year is their student loan indebtedness. The average, unfortunately, is higher. The average is over $25,000, and for some students, it's almost astronomical what they end up borrowing. I can't even imagine the cost of colleges and law schools today, and medical schools and dental schools, and the debt that is involved. Which leads me to the second point in history, and I think it was sometime in the 1960s. Somebody wrote a story about student loan borrowers who went to medical school, finished medical school, then got their licenses to practice medicine. Pretty good opportunity to make some real money in life, but they had one more stop. They stopped at the bankruptcy court, and they discharged their loans, their student loans, in a bankruptcy court, and then went on to practice medicine. Well, that sounded like a pretty bad deal for the government, which trusted them to get a degree and earn enough money to pay back the loan, and in the fairness of this, that they wouldn't accept their responsibility. So someone dreamed up the idea, well, let's make sure that you cannot discharge your loan, your student loan, in bankruptcy court. There are a handful of debts that you can incur that cannot be discharged in bankruptcy court, but just a handful. Taxes that you owe the government, for example, I believe are not dischargeable. Money that you owe in divorce settlements and child support are not dischargeable, and a handful of other things. But otherwise, anything you could borrow money for, you could go to bankruptcy court and say, I want to walk away from all my debts and achieve that goal. For example, if you had a mortgage on your home and you wanted to be discharged from paying off that mortgage, you could do it in bankruptcy court. You may or may not have any home left after the discharge in bankruptcy, but that's a fact. If you borrowed money to buy a boat, you could discharge that loan in bankruptcy. To buy a car, discharge it in bankruptcy. A second home, discharge it in bankruptcy. But when it came to student loans, we said, because some of these people took advantage and didn't pay back their loans, we're not going to allow you to discharge it in bankruptcy. And it ultimately meant that for those who borrowed money to go to school and college when they were 19 or 20 years old, they would have a debt that they had to pay back or carry to the grave. Literally, carry it to the grave. There was no way to get rid of it. And so what happened, we know. A lot of people got too deeply in debt. It turned out even the promise of their college diploma was not enough to meet their obligation. And so they were deeply in debt. Now let me mention a third category of things. We started, Mr. President, before you arrived with Sputnik, which changed the world, and National Defense Education Act. We went to the change in the bankruptcy law that said you can't discharge a student loan in bankruptcy. Now let me introduce a third phenomenon. And I've done this on the floor before, but I'm going to give you two numbers, and I want you to get out your pens and pencils, write them down, because they're going to be on the final, okay? Two numbers, 8 and 33. 8 and 33. So when you see the question on the final of what percentage of high school graduates go to for-profit colleges and universities, hold up your hand, it's 8%. 8% of kids coming out of high school go to for-profit colleges and universities. Those are the ones that are heavily advertised. You see them everywhere. 33. What percentage of all student loan defaults are students who went to for-profit colleges and universities? 33%. 8% of the students, 33% of the student loan defaults. What's going on here? Why are those students so disproportionately defaulting on their student loan debt? Several reasons. They were misled into going to these schools that are worthless. Worthless. They used to run ads on Washington TV that showed this lovely young lady. She was in her bedroom in her pajamas with a laptop computer saying, I'm going to college. And you think to yourself, get real. This isn't real college. This is just a way to get you to pay too much in tuition for something that's basically worthless. And students do. 8% of high school students do it. So the point I'm making is that many of these students are deceived and duped into going to these colleges. Promises they make about what these degrees are worth and how easy it is to acquire an associate's or a bachelor's degree. So they're deeply in debt. They can't find a job to take care of it. I'm going to tell you the story of one of them in just a moment. But put those three things together and you can understand why we need to do something about student loans in America. Yes, we need student loans in America. They're good for America and its economy. Should they be dischargeable in bankruptcy? I think under some circumstances they should be. If you paid back 10 years of your student loans and you still had a balance and you were literally head over heels in debt, you ought to be able to discharge that in bankruptcy. You've tried your best. 10 years is enough. That's one approach. But the other approach, President Biden has just suggested. That's why he's issued a one-time student loan debt relief plan to ease the college debt burden on middle and lower income families. Under the president's plan, the government will erase $10,000 in federal student loan debt for borrowers with income of less than $125,000 a year. If you're married and filed taxes jointly or head of household and you qualify if your income is $250,000 or less. If you received a Pell Grant while you were going to college, and those are for lower income families, you could qualify for an extra $10,000 in student loan cancellation. Under the president's plan, 43 million Americans will receive some amount of debt cancellation. A majority of them, about 27 million borrowers, will see up to $20,000 knocked off their student loan balance. For 20 million borrowers, that's enough to totally wipe out their entire student loan balance. They literally can start again. They can consider going back to school, maybe even a good school that gives them the kind of training, education, or degree that really can lead to a better life. Or they could try to take another course of action. There are other approaches. I've got labor unions all over my state begging for apprentices, good paying jobs for skilled craftsmen and the like. They don't need a college degree to achieve that. Some of them can consider it. Everyone who qualifies for relief will get a lower monthly payment, at least, and that means real help now. Of course, that isn't the real complete solution to the challenge. Too many colleges are charging too much money. When I ask about a nice college, what does that nice college have for tuition? I visited one just over the August break, and somebody said, it's $72,000 a year. I said, for tuition? How in the world can it be? Well, they give a lot of student grants and scholarships and fellowships and this and the other thing. But the cost of higher education is getting beyond the reach of average people, and that's a big problem. We need to have affordable education and education that helps you meet your goals. I might also say that some of the people that have been involved in borrowing money have some sad stories to tell. Vicki Vinces is one of the thousands of Illinois students who were deceived by one of these for-profit colleges called Westwood. Vicki grew up on the south side of Chicago. She's the first person in her family to attend college. She watched too many CSI episodes, and she decided that was what she wanted to do with her life, criminal justice. She enrolled in a criminal justice program at Westwood College in 2004 in Chicago. She believed the recruiters. They said a degree from Westwood's going to open the door for you, young lady, right into the field of law enforcement. She found the opposite was true. They laughed at her when she showed her resume from Westwood College and said, that's not a real college, that's not a real degree, and that doesn't help you a bit. Because Westwood hid the truth about the fact that they were not accredited in Illinois, a lot of young people were duped into believing it was a ticket to a good law enforcement job. By the time Vicki figured out how badly she was into it, she had $50,000 in student loan debt, and she didn't have even a Westwood degree to point to. For the last 15 years, what's she been doing? Well, for a large part of it, living in her parents' basement. That's what life was really left for her to try to get by with, is just get by with your parents' basement. That's unfortunate. She could have done a lot more with her life were it not for the student debt and the deception of these for-profit schools. She's working for mostly nonprofit organizations. She finds it hard to make any of her loan payments. She's going to get a break with the Biden proposal. And that's why I have to tell you I was a little upset with one of our colleagues, and I won't name names, you're not supposed to do that on the Senate floor, but he started mocking the students who were heavily in debt. I think he referred to them as slatternly baristas. I think that means that they're lazy and they work at Starbucks. And here they have too much debt and it's their own damn fault. I couldn't disagree more. Students, when you're 19 or 20 years old, don't know what is a reasonable debt and what isn't. They just don't have a life experience. Many of them are first-generation college students in their family. Mom and dad aren't much help. They want to see their kids get a college degree. That's supposed to be the ticket to success. So young people sign up for loans, and they sign up in schools that really can't produce a diploma that leads to a job, and they get stuck with it. Vicki, I mentioned earlier, has tried her best to pay off these loans and doesn't have much luck. She says that being freed of some of this debt is going to be at least the lifting a part of the burden, but she's still got a lot of debt to go. Let's be honest about it. I don't think she's lazy, and I don't know if a barista has now become a negative term. I don't think it is. Those folks are working, and I respect the fact that they are. She said, and I quote, "I'm not asking for anything for free. I just think that things should be fair. Education should be affordable, and we ought to be able to earn enough to pay back what we owe." These Republican colleagues of mine are setting out to stop this executive order by Joe Biden. I guess it'll be a great source of pride if they do it. They can say, we stopped this relief for all of these young people in debt. We sunk them deeper in despair, and we did it because it's an election year. I think it's unfortunate. President's student loan forgiveness plan is not a giveaway to rich doctors and lawyers who racked up big debt at Ivy League schools. 98% of the student loan borrowers did not attend those schools. The majority of these debts are held by families who have zero net worth. Zero. What will their life be like without help? Nearly 90% of the relief dollars in the president's plan go to borrowers earning less than $75,000 a year. And let's reflect for a moment what's happened over the last 3 years in the United States of America under the previous president, who will go unnamed, and what we've seen because of this pandemic. Remember when we came up and were able to articulate the word $1 trillion without shaking? We started talking about $1 trillion relief packages in the pandemic. And we said to people, we're going to have loans through the Small Business Administration for people who have a job or a business and need a helping hand in terms of borrowing money to get by. And if you can prove that you spent the money on payroll and utilities and rent, it's forgiven. So take a look at that mechanism. Through no fault of their own, they were stuck with a debt because of the pandemic. They borrowed the money from federal government, taxpayers' money, and if they could spend it for the right things, it was forgiven. A walk away. I didn't hear a lot of speeches about slatternly baristas at that point in time. And we've also seen it happen before. In fact, we've had a number of members of Congress who applied for some of those PPP loans. The same people who are criticizing forgiving student loan debts literally, personally borrowed money that they didn't pay back to the federal government. And they don't think there's anything wrong with that. I could go into a long list of people who have benefited by loans that were forgiven or grants given by the federal government. Rather than go through that list, let me say the bottom line is this. If we can help these young student borrowers get an opportunity to reduce the debt that they owe and get their lives back online, that is a great outcome for them and a great one for this nation. The same type of idealism that drove us to the National Defense Education Act after Sputnik applies as well today. We should have well-trained, well-educated American workforce ready to compete with the world. I think we can do it. Joe Biden's step is a reasonable, humane step in the right direction. It should have bipartisan support. I yield the floor.